The city's night air was thick with the scent of exhaust and decay. Marcus huddled under a shop awning, his makeshift shelter for the night. His worn blanket did little to cushion the hard concrete beneath him, but it was better than nothing. He watched the bustling streets with weary eyes, observing the stark contrast between the gleaming high-rises and the crumbling buildings of his neighborhood. As people hurried past, their eyes carefully avoiding his, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on the circumstances that had led him to this point. He had once held a steady job, a small apartment, and dreams of a better future. But a series of misfortunes, a workplace injury, mounting medical bills, and finally eviction, had stripped away everything he had worked for. Now, at 35, he found himself invisible to the world around him, just another face in the growing crowd of the city's homeless. The inequality that surrounded him was a constant reminder of society's failures. He watched as sleek cars pulled up to trendy restaurants, their occupants laughing and chatting without a care in the world. Meanwhile, just a few blocks away, families struggled to put food on the table and keep a roof over their heads. Marcus was pulled from his thoughts by an unusual sight. Smoke was rising from an old, abandoned building a few streets over. At first, he dismissed it as another bonfire set by squatters trying to keep warm. But as the smoke thickened and took on a more ominous hue, he realized this was something more serious. Without hesitation, Marcus gathered his few possessions and headed toward the smoke. As he approached the building, the acrid smell of burning materials filled his nostrils. The old structure, once a grand apartment complex, now stood as a hollowed-out shell of its former self. Graffiti covered its walls, and most of its windows were shattered or boarded up. The smoke was pouring out of a second-floor window, and as Marcus drew closer, he heard something that made his blood run cold, a faint cry for help. Without thinking twice, he rushed toward the building's entrance. The door hung off its hinges, providing easy access to the smoke-filled interior. As Marcus entered, the heat hit him like a wall. Flames licked at the walls, spreading rapidly through the dry, rotting wood. He pulled his shirt over his nose and mouth, trying to filter out the thick smoke that threatened to choke him. The cries for help grew louder, guiding him through the burning building. Navigating the treacherous hallways, Marcus fought against the instinct to turn back. The floor creaked ominously beneath his feet, and burning debris fell around him. But the thought of someone trapped in this inferno spurred him on. He climbed the stairs, each step a test of the structure's integrity. The second floor was a maze of flame and smoke. Marcus called out, straining to hear a response over the roar of the fire. Finally, a weak voice answered from behind a closed door. With a burst of adrenaline, Marcus charged forward, shouldering the door open. Through the haze, he saw a figure huddled in the corner, a woman, clearly disoriented and struggling to breathe. Without hesitation, he scooped her up in his arms and turned back toward the exit. The journey out was a blur of heat, smoke, and terror. Marcus focused solely on putting one foot in front of the other, clutching the woman tightly to his chest. The building groaned and shifted around them, threatening to collapse at any moment. As they burst through the entrance and into the cool night air, Marcus heard the wail of approaching sirens. He carried the woman a safe distance from the building before gently setting her down on the sidewalk. As she coughed and gasped for air, Marcus finally got a good look at the person he had rescued. To his surprise, she was dressed in expensive clothing, now soot-stained and torn. Her blonde hair was singed, and her face was streaked with ash, but there was no mistaking the air of refinement about her. As their eyes met, a moment of understanding passed between them. Two people from vastly different worlds, brought together by circumstance and courage. As the flames continued to engulf the building behind them, Marcus and the woman he had rescued sat on the curb, catching their breath. The woman, still coughing from smoke inhalation, turned to Marcus with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse. "You saved my life." "I'm Elizabeth." Marcus nodded, his own throat raw from the smoke. Marcus, he replied simply. What were you doing in there? Elizabeth hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. I was hiding, she admitted. I'm not who I appear to be. As sirens wailed in the distance, Elizabeth began to explain. She was born into a wealthy family, heir to a vast fortune and a life of luxury. But the gilded cage of high society had become unbearable. The constant pressure to maintain appearances, the loveless marriage arranged by her parents, the feeling that her entire life was scripted, it had all become too much. So I ran, she said. I've been living in that building for weeks, trying to figure out what to do next. Marcus listened silently, his expression a mix of disbelief and skepticism. The idea that someone would willingly leave a life of comfort for the streets seemed absurd to him. You're telling me you chose to be homeless? He asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Elizabeth flinched at his tone. I know it sounds crazy, she said, but I couldn't bear that life anymore. I needed to find something real, something meaningful. Marcus shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. Lady, you have no idea what real struggle is. Elizabeth's face flushed with shame. You're right, she admitted. I don't, but I want to understand. I want to make a difference. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a wad of cash, her last connection to her old life. Please, she said, holding it out to Marcus. Take this. It's the least I can do to thank you. Marcus stared at the money, temptation warring with pride. Finally, he shook his head. Keep it, he said. But if you really want to make a difference, help me figure out what caused that fire. Something doesn't feel right about it. Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. Okay, she agreed. Where do we start? As the fire trucks arrived and began battling the blaze, Marcus and Elizabeth slipped away from the crowd. They circled around to the back of the building, looking for any signs of what might have started the fire. This building's been abandoned for years, Marcus explained as they picked their way through overgrown weeds. But lately, there's been talk about some big development project in the neighborhood. Lots of people getting pushed out. Elizabeth frowned. You think the fire might be connected? Marcus shrugged. Could be. Wouldn't be the first time a mysterious fire cleared the way for new construction. As they searched, Elizabeth's eyes caught something glinting in the grass. She bent down and picked up a small glass bottle. Look at this, she said, holding it up to Marcus. It smells like gasoline. Marcus took the bottle, his expression grim. Definitely not an accident then, he muttered. They continued their search, finding more evidence that pointed to arson. Scraps of paper with partial blueprints, a discarded lighter, and most damning of all, a crumpled document detailing plans for a luxury condominium complex to be built on the site. As they pieced together the evidence, the reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just about one building. It was part of a larger plan to gentrify the entire neighborhood, pushing out longtime residents to make way for high-end developments. This is bigger than we thought, Elizabeth said, her voice quiet but determined. We need to do something about this. Marcus looked at her, seeing her in a new light. Maybe she wasn't just another rich person playing at being poor. Maybe she really did want to make a difference. All right, he said finally. But if we're going to do this, we need to be smart about it. These people, whoever they are, they're powerful. They won't hesitate to crush anyone who gets in their way. Elizabeth nodded, a fire in her eyes that matched the determination in Marcus's voice. I understand, she said. But I'm not afraid. Not anymore. As the sun began to rise, casting a golden glow over the smoldering remains of the building, Marcus and Elizabeth made a pact. They would uncover the truth behind the fire and the gentrification plans, no matter the cost. It was the beginning of an unlikely partnership. A homeless man and a millionaire heiress, united in their quest for justice. Little did they know, their investigation would uncover a web of corruption that ran deeper than either of them could have imagined and would put both their lives in danger. But in that moment, as they stood side by side watching the dawn break over the city, they felt a spark of hope. Together, they might just be able to make a difference after all. In the days that followed, Marcus and Elizabeth immersed themselves in the community, seeking out those affected by the ongoing gentrification. They found themselves in a small community center, surrounded by a diverse group of residents, each with their own story of displacement and struggle. An elderly woman named Rosa, her face lined with years of worry, spoke of how her family had lived in the neighborhood for generations. "Now they want to push us out," she said, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "Where are we supposed to go?" A young father, Mike, described how he'd lost his job when the local factory closed down. "They said it was progress," he scoffed. "But all I see is my family struggling to survive while these developers get richer." As Marcus listened to each story, he felt a deep resonance with his own experiences. He shared his own journey, from a steady job to homelessness, the result of circumstances beyond his control. His words sparked nods of understanding and murmurs of agreement from the group. Elizabeth sat quietly, absorbing every word. The reality of these people's lives was so far removed from her own privileged upbringing that it felt like she was learning about a different world. Yet she could see the strength, resilience, and sense of community that bound these people together. As the meeting wound down, Elizabeth found herself talking with Sarah, a social worker who had been helping the displaced residents. In a quiet corner, Elizabeth began to open up about her own past. "I was trapped," Elizabeth confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "My husband, he wasn't the man everyone thought he was. Behind closed doors, he was controlling, manipulative, sometimes violent." Sarah listened with empathy, gently encouraging Elizabeth to continue. Elizabeth described the years of emotional abuse, the isolation from friends and family, the constant fear that permeated her seemingly perfect life. "I couldn't take it anymore," Elizabeth said, wiping away a tear. "So I ran. I left everything behind and created a new identity. But I was lost, alone, until the fire, until Marcus." As Elizabeth shared her story, Marcus found himself eavesdropping. He'd misjudged her, he realized. Her struggle might have been different from his own, but it was no less real. Later, as they walked back to the abandoned building that had become their makeshift base of operations, Marcus and Elizabeth found themselves opening up to each other in a way they hadn't before. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "I judged you without knowing your story. That wasn't fair of me." Elizabeth shook her head. "You had every right to be skeptical. I know my problems must seem trivial compared to what you and others here have faced." "Pain is pain," Marcus replied. "Just because someone else might have it worse doesn't make your suffering any less real." They walked in silence for a moment before Elizabeth spoke again. "You know, I've spent my whole life surrounded by people, but I've never felt as understood as I do right now, with you and this community." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Despite the hardships he'd faced, he'd found a sense of belonging among the homeless community that he'd never experienced in his previous life. As they reached their destination, they paused, looking out over the city. The sun was setting, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks. It was a beautiful sight, but they both knew that behind the picturesque facade lay a city divided, a community in crisis. "We can't let them win," Elizabeth said, her voice filled with determination. "We have to fight this, for Rosa, for Mike, for everyone who calls this place home." Marcus looked at her, seeing not the scared, lost woman he'd pulled from the fire, but a strong, determined ally. "We will," he promised. "Together." As they settled in for the night, Both Marcus and Elizabeth felt a sense of purpose they hadn't experienced in years. They were no longer just survivors, but fighters, ready to take on the forces threatening their community. Little did they know, their fight was about to become much more dangerous than they could have imagined. The powers behind the gentrification project were not about to let a homeless man and a runaway heiress stand in their way. But for now, in the quiet of the night, Marcus and Elizabeth found strength in their newfound friendship and the knowledge that they were no longer alone in their struggles. The following week, Marcus and Elizabeth decided to organize a community meeting to discuss the fire and the broader issue of gentrification. They secured a small room in the local library, spreading the word through flyers and word of mouth. On the day of the meeting, the room was packed. Familiar faces from the neighborhood mingled with curious onlookers. Marcus stood at the front, his usual confidence tempered by nervousness. Elizabeth sat in the front row, offering a reassuring smile. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "We're here because our community is under threat. The fire at the old apartment building wasn't an accident. It's part of a larger plan to push us out of our homes." A murmur ran through the crowd. Marcus continued, laying out what he and Elizabeth had discovered. As he spoke, the atmosphere in the room grew tense with anger and fear. Just as the meeting was reaching its peak, a man in the back stood up. "Marcus, Elizabeth," he called out. "I'm Jack Thompson, investigative journalist with the City Herald. I'd like to help you uncover the truth about this." Jack made his way to the front, explaining that he'd been working on a story about corruption in city development projects. "Your fire might be the missing piece I've been looking for," he said. After the meeting, Marcus, Elizabeth, and Jack huddled in a corner of the library, sharing information. Jack's investigative skills complemented Marcus's street-level knowledge and Elizabeth's insider understanding of corporate tactics. "We need hard evidence," Jack explained. "Documents, recordings, anything that can prove this isn't just coincidence." Elizabeth nodded. "I might be able to help with that. I still have some connections in the business world. Maybe I can get us into some of these developer meetings." Marcus looked concerned. "That could be dangerous, Elizabeth. These people won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens their plans." "I know," she replied, her jaw set with determination. "But it's a risk we have to take." Over the next few days, the trio worked tirelessly. Jack dug through public records, looking for suspicious patterns in property acquisitions. Marcus talked to his contacts on the streets, gathering whispered rumors and overheard conversations. Elizabeth reached out to old acquaintances, carefully probing for information. Their breakthrough came unexpectedly. Elizabeth managed to secure an invitation to a private fundraiser for a local politician, known for his pro-development stance. Dressed in borrowed finery, she slipped into the event, a hidden microphone capturing every conversation. As the evening wore on, Elizabeth found herself in a secluded corner with the politician and a prominent developer. Their guards down after a few drinks, they began to speak freely about their plans for the neighborhood. "Once we clear out the riffraff," the developer said, his voice slurred but gleeful, "we'll have prime real estate. The profits will be astronomical." The politician chuckled. "And of course, your generous contributions to my re-election campaign are much appreciated. I'll make sure the zoning changes go through without a hitch." Elizabeth's heart raced as she recorded the damning conversation. This was exactly what they needed. Proof of the corruption that was destroying their community. As soon as she could, Elizabeth slipped away from the party and rushed to meet Marcus and Jack. They huddled around a laptop in Jack's small apartment, listening to the recording with growing excitement. "This is it," Jack said, his eyes shining. "This is the smoking gun we needed. With this, we can blow the whole thing wide open." Marcus nodded, a mix of relief and apprehension on his face. "So what's our next move?" Jack thought for a moment. "We need to compile all our evidence. This recording, the documents from the fire, everything we've gathered. Then we go public. A press conference maybe. Get the whole city's attention. Elizabeth agreed. We'll need to move fast. Once they realize what we have, they'll do anything to stop us. As they planned their next steps, a sense of nervous energy filled the room. They were on the verge of exposing a major scandal, one that could reshape the future of their community. But with that potential came great risk. They were up against powerful people who wouldn't hesitate to use any means necessary to protect their interests. Marcus looked at his unlikely allies, a journalist hungry for the truth and a former socialite who'd found her purpose. He realized that together, they just might have a chance to make a real difference. "All right," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "Let's do this. For our community, for justice, for everyone who's been pushed aside in the name of progress. It's time to fight back." As they worked late into the night, preparing for the battle ahead, none of them realized just how high the stakes would become, or the personal sacrifices they would be called upon to make in their quest for justice. The following days were a whirlwind of activity as Marcus, Elizabeth, and Jack prepared for their public stand against the corruption they'd uncovered. They decided to hold a protest rally, combining it with a press conference to release their evidence. Marcus took charge of mobilizing the community. He went from street corners to community centers, rallying support and explaining the importance of their united stand. His passion was contagious, inspiring even the most disheartened residents to join their cause. "This is our chance," he told a group gathered in a local church basement. "Our chance to show them we won't be pushed out, that we have a right to our homes and our community." Elizabeth, meanwhile, focused on logistics. She used her organizational skills to coordinate transportation for elderly residents, arrange for childcare during the protest, and ensure they had all necessary permits. Her attention to detail ensured that nothing could be used as an excuse to shut down their demonstration. Jack worked tirelessly to prepare their evidence for presentation. He compiled a comprehensive dossier, fact-checking every detail and creating a narrative that would be clear and compelling to both the media and the general public. As the day of the protest approached, the energy in the neighborhood was palpable. People were making signs, practicing chants, and spreading the word. The sense of community had never been stronger. The night before the big day, Marcus, Elizabeth, and Jack met for a final strategy session. The mood was tense, but determined. "Remember," Jack said, "we need to stay focused, stick to the facts. Don't let them provoke us into saying or doing anything that could discredit our message." Elizabeth nodded. "I've arranged for some pro bono lawyers to be present, just in case. And I've alerted sympathetic media outlets to make sure we get fair coverage." Marcus was about to respond when his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, his face darkening. "It's an unknown number," he said, putting the phone on speaker. A distorted voice came through. "Back off now, or you'll regret it. This is your only warning." The line went dead. The three looked at each other, a mix of fear and determination in their eyes. "They're scared," Jack said after a moment. "This means we're on the right track." Marcus nodded, his jaw set. "I'm not backing down. Not now. Not ever." Elizabeth reached out, placing her hand over Marcus's. "We're in this together. All of us." As they parted ways for the night, each felt the weight of what was to come. They had started this journey as strangers, thrown together by circumstance. Now, they were united in a cause bigger than themselves. Marcus returned to his usual sleeping spot, his mind racing. He thought about how far he'd come, from a man with nothing left to lose to someone fighting for an entire community. The threat loomed in his mind, but it only strengthened his resolve. Elizabeth, in her small rented room, sat up late into the night. She thought about her old life, the wealth and privilege she'd left behind. For the first time, she felt she was doing something truly meaningful. The danger didn't scare her. It invigorated her. Jack, surrounded by stacks of documents in his cluttered apartment, put the finishing touches on their presentation. He'd pursued many stories in his career, but none had felt as important as this. He knew the risks, but the truth was worth it. As dawn broke on the day of the protest, the three met at their designated spot. The streets were already filling with people, carrying signs and banners. News vans were setting up, cameras at the ready. Marcus looked out at the gathering crowd, then back at Elizabeth and Jack. "Whatever happens today," he said, "I want you both to know. Thank you for believing in this, for believing in me." Elizabeth smiled, blinking back tears. "Thank you for showing me what real courage looks like." Jack nodded, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. "Let's go make history." As they stepped forward to take their places at the front of the crowd, they knew that this moment would define not just their lives, but the future of their community. The road ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, but they were ready to face whatever came their way. Together, they took a deep breath and stepped into the spotlight, ready to fight for justice, for their community, and for the truth. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gathering crowd as Marcus, Elizabeth, and Jack took their positions at the makeshift podium. The air buzzed with nervous energy, a mix of hope and apprehension palpable among the protesters. Marcus stepped forward first, his voice strong despite the butterflies in his stomach. "We're here today because our community is under attack," he began, his words carrying across the hushed crowd. "Not by outsiders, but by the very people who swore to protect and serve us." As Marcus laid out their findings, the crowd's murmurs grew louder, punctuated by gasps and angry exclamations. He detailed the connection between the mysterious fires, the forced evictions, and the corrupt dealings of local officials and developers. Jack followed, presenting their evidence methodically. He displayed enlarged copies of incriminating documents, played audio recordings of damning conversations, and showed a timeline that connected all the pieces of their investigation. The crowd's anger was palpable now, their chants growing louder. "Homes, not profit. Stop the corruption." The energy was electric, cameras flashing as reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. Then, it was Elizabeth's turn. She stepped up to the microphone, taking a deep breath. This was the moment she had been both dreading and anticipating. "My name is Elizabeth Hartley," she began, her voice shaking slightly. A ripple of surprise went through the crowd as some recognized the name of one of the city's wealthiest families. "I was born into privilege, into the very world that is trying to destroy this community. But I stand here today to say, no more." She went on to detail her own journey, from a life of luxury to living on the streets, and how it opened her eyes to the real struggles faced by so many. "I've seen firsthand the strength, the resilience, and the beauty of this community," she said, her voice growing stronger, "and I will not stand by while it's torn apart for profit." As Elizabeth spoke, Marcus noticed movement at the edges of the crowd. Police officers were gathering, their faces grim. He caught Jack's eye, nodding slightly towards the approaching threat. Just as Elizabeth was finishing her speech, a police captain stepped forward, megaphone in hand. "This gathering is unlawful," his voice boomed. "Disperse immediately or face arrest." The crowd's reaction was immediate and loud. Boos and jeers erupted, along with shouts of "shame" and "whose side are you on?" Marcus quickly took the microphone again. "Stay calm," he urged the crowd. "We have a right to be here. We have a right to be heard." But even as he spoke, the police began to move in, pushing against the edges of the crowd. Panic began to spread as people were shoved and pulled apart. Elizabeth grabbed Marcus's arm. "We can't let this turn violent," she said urgently. "We'll lose everything we've worked for." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. He turned back to the microphone. "Everyone, please," he shouted over the growing chaos. "Remember why we're here. We're not here to fight the police. "We're here to fight injustice. Stand your ground, but peacefully." His words seemed to have an effect. The crowd began to link arms, forming a human chain. They started singing, an old civil rights anthem that rose above the shouting and the noise of the police sirens. As the standoff continued, news helicopters circled overhead. The entire city was watching now, seeing firsthand the peaceful protesters facing off against the aggressive police response. In the midst of the chaos, Jack managed to slip away, rushing to get their evidence to his editor. No matter what happened here, the truth would get out. Marcus and Elizabeth stood their ground at the center of the crowd, arms linked with those around them. They exchanged a look of determination mixed with fear. This was the moment of truth. Everything they had worked for hung in the balance. As the police line moved closer, Marcus whispered to Elizabeth, "Whatever happens, we're in this together." Elizabeth nodded, squeezing his hand. "Together," she echoed. The protest had become more than they had planned, more than they could have imagined. It had become a symbol of resistance, of a community fighting for its very existence. And as the tension reached its peak, Marcus, Elizabeth, and their allies stood firm, ready to face whatever came next in their fight for justice. As the police line pressed forward, the protest descended into chaos. The peaceful chants gave way to shouts of fear and anger. Marcus tried to maintain order, his voice hoarse as he called for calm, but his words were drowned out by the cacophony of conflict. In the confusion, Marcus and Elizabeth were separated. Marcus found himself pushed back by the surging crowd, away from the center of the protest. He fought against the tide of people, desperately trying to spot Elizabeth's blonde hair in the sea of faces. "Elizabeth," he shouted, but his voice was lost in the noise. Meanwhile, Elizabeth had been cornered by a group of officers. Her heart raced as she raised her hands, trying to show she wasn't a threat. "I'm not resisting," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "We have a right to peaceful protest." But her words fell on deaf ears. An officer grabbed her arm roughly, spinning her around to cuff her. As they led her away, Elizabeth caught a glimpse of Marcus in the distance, still fighting to reach her. Their eyes met for a brief moment before she was pushed into a waiting police van. Marcus, seeing Elizabeth being taken away, felt a surge of anger and helplessness. He pushed harder against the crowd, determined to reach her, but strong hands grabbed him from behind. He turned to see two officers restraining him. "You're under arrest for inciting a riot," one of them growled. As they cuffed him, Marcus saw Jack in the distance, safely outside the fray, filming everything on his phone. At least someone was documenting what was really happening, Marcus thought as he was led away. While Marcus and Elizabeth were being processed at the police station, Jack was racing against time. He rushed back to his apartment, hurriedly uploading the video footage and sending it to every news outlet he could think of. Then, he turned his attention to the evidence they had gathered. Jack knew that with Marcus and Elizabeth in custody, he was now solely responsible for exposing the truth. He worked through the night, cross-referencing their findings with public records, following money trails, and connecting dots that had previously seemed unrelated. As dawn broke, Jack sat back, exhausted, but exhilarated. He had uncovered something even bigger than they had initially suspected. The corruption didn't just involve local officials and developers. It reached all the way to the state level, implicating several high-ranking politicians. Meanwhile, Elizabeth found herself in an unexpected situation. Upon learning her true identity, the police had treated her with deference, quickly releasing her without charges. She stood outside the station, torn between relief at her freedom and guilt over Marcus's continued detention. Making a split-second decision, Elizabeth hailed a taxi. "Take me to the Hartley building," she instructed the driver. It was time to use her family connections for something good. Elizabeth's sudden appearance at Hartley Industries caused a stir. Employees whispered and stared as she strode purposefully through the lobby, her disheveled appearance a stark contrast to the sleek corporate environment. She burst into her father's office unannounced. "Dad," she said, her voice firm, "we need to talk." For the next hour, Elizabeth laid out everything: her time on the streets, the corrupt development plans, the unjust arrests. Her father listened in stunned silence. "I need your help," Elizabeth concluded. "Use your influence to get Marcus released. And then, we need to stop this corruption for good." Her father leaned back in his chair, a mix of emotions playing across his face: concern, pride, and a dawning understanding. "All right," he said finally. "Let's see what we can do." As Elizabeth worked to secure Marcus's release, Jack was preparing to go public with their expanded findings. He had arranged a meeting with a group of trusted journalists from various outlets, ensuring that the story would be too big to be buried or discredited. Just as Jack was about to leave for the meeting, his phone rang. It was Elizabeth. "Jack," she said, her voice urgent. "I've got Marcus out, but there's more. My father's agreed to help us. He's got connections that could blow this whole thing wide open." Jack's mind raced with the possibilities. "This changes everything," he said. "Meet me at my place. Bring Marcus and your father. We need to regroup and plan our next move." As he hung up, Jack felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. They were on the verge of something big, something that could change the city forever. But he also knew that the bigger the story, the more dangerous their enemies would become. The stakes had just been raised exponentially. As Jack gathered his materials for the meeting, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were entering the most perilous phase of their fight yet. But with Elizabeth's newfound allies and the expanded scope of their investigation, they also had their best chance yet at achieving real, lasting change. The next few hours would be crucial. Jack took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. Whatever happened, there was no turning back now. The atmosphere in Jack's cramped apartment was electric as Marcus, Elizabeth, her father Richard Hartley, and Jack gathered around the cluttered dining table. The walls, covered in pinned documents and connected strings, resembled a complex web of corruption they were trying to unravel. Marcus, still bearing the marks of his brief incarceration, was the first to speak. "Before we go any further, I need to know," he said, turning to Richard. "Are you really on board with this? Because once we start, there's no going back." Richard Hartley, his usually impeccable suit slightly rumpled, nodded solemnly. "Elizabeth has opened my eyes to what's really happening in this city. I've been complicit in my ignorance for too long. It's time to make things right." Jack cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention to the laptop in front of him. "What I've uncovered goes beyond anything we initially suspected," he began. He pulled up a complex diagram on the screen. "The corruption doesn't just stop at the local level, it goes all the way up to the state government." As Jack explained the intricate web of kickbacks, shell companies, and political favors, the others listened in stunned silence. The scale of the corruption was staggering. "We're not just dealing with a few greedy developers anymore," Jack concluded. "This is systemic corruption that's been entrenched for years." Elizabeth leaned forward, her face set with determination. "So how do we fight this? It seems overwhelming." Marcus, who had been quiet throughout Jack's explanation, spoke up. "We need to take this public in a big way. No more small protests or local news stories. We need to make sure every person in this state knows what's going on." Richard nodded in agreement. "I can help with that. I have connections in the media, influential friends who owe me favors. We can arrange a press conference that no one will be able to ignore." "But we need to be careful," Jack warned. "The people we're up against won't hesitate to use any means necessary to stop us. We need ironclad evidence and a plan to protect ourselves." They spent the next few hours meticulously going through every piece of evidence, every connection, every allegation. Richard made calls to his lawyers, ensuring that everything they presented would be legally sound. Elizabeth worked on crafting a narrative that would resonate with the public, while Marcus focused on how to mobilize community support. As dawn broke, they had a plan. They would hold a major press conference in 3 days' time, presenting all their evidence and calling for a full state investigation into the corruption. Richard would use his influence to ensure maximum media coverage, while Jack would coordinate with his journalist contacts to provide in-depth follow-up reporting. "What about security?" Marcus asked, voicing the concern they'd all been avoiding. "These people have already shown they're willing to use violence to protect their interests." Richard pulled out his phone. "I have a security firm I trust. They'll provide protection for all of us leading up to and during the press conference." As they finalized the details, there was a palpable sense of both excitement and trepidation in the room. They were about to take on some of the most powerful people in the state, and the risks were enormous. "Are we really ready for this?" Elizabeth asked, looking around at her unlikely allies. Marcus reached out and took her hand. "Ready or not, it's time. Our community is counting on us." Jack nodded, a determined glint in his eye. "We have the truth on our side. It's time to let it shine." Richard stood, straightening his jacket. "I'll make the calls to set things in motion. The press conference will be held at the Hartley Building. It's time I used my position for something worthwhile." As they prepared to part ways, each to fulfill their role in the coming days, there was a moment of silent understanding between them. They had started this journey as strangers, brought together by circumstance. Now, they stood united, ready to fight for justice, no matter the cost. The next 3 days would be crucial. As they left Jack's apartment, stepping into the bright morning sunlight, each of them knew that win or lose, their lives would never be the same after this. The countdown to the press conference had begun, and with it, their final push to expose the truth and change their city forever. The day of the press conference arrived with a mix of tension and anticipation. The Hartley Building's largest conference room had been transformed into a media center, with cameras, microphones, and journalists from every major news outlet in the state packed tightly together. Marcus, Elizabeth, Jack, and Richard gathered in a small side room, going over their notes one last time. The atmosphere was tense, each of them acutely aware of the magnitude of what they were about to do. "Remember," Jack said, his voice low and serious, "stick to the facts. Don't let them provoke you into saying anything that could be misconstrued." Elizabeth nodded, her face pale but determined. "We've prepared for this. We're ready." As they made their way to the podium, the room fell silent. Cameras flashed, and the low murmur of the crowd died down as Marcus stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "We're here today to expose a truth that has been hidden for far too long. A truth about corruption, greed, and the betrayal of public trust." Marcus laid out their findings, his words clear and concise. He spoke of the arson, the forced evictions, the backroom deals that had torn communities apart. As he talked, slides and documents were displayed on the large screen behind him, providing irrefutable evidence of their claims. Jack followed, delving deeper into the complex web of corruption they had uncovered. He named names, showed financial records, and played audio recordings that implicated high-ranking officials in the scandal. The room was abuzz with the furious scribbling of journalists and the constant click of cameras. The magnitude of the revelations was clear. This was bigger than anyone had anticipated. As Elizabeth stepped up to speak, a commotion at the back of the room caught everyone's attention. A man stood up, his face red with anger. "This is all lies," he shouted. "I'm Detective Johnson of the police force, and I'm here to tell you that these people are criminals spreading false information." The room erupted into chaos. Journalists shouted questions. Security moved towards the detective, and for a moment, it seemed like everything might unravel. But then, something unexpected happened. Richard Hartley stepped forward, placing a calming hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. "Detective Johnson," Richard said, his voice carrying over the din, "I believe you have something to add to this discussion. Perhaps about the instructions you received to suppress evidence related to the arsons in the disputed neighborhoods." The detective's face paled. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. Richard's voice was calm but firm. "I think you do. In fact, I think you're here today because you're ready to tell the truth. Aren't you, Detective?" There was a moment of tense silence. Then, to everyone's shock, Detective Johnson's shoulders slumped. "You're right," he said, his voice barely audible. "I can't do this anymore. I'm ready to come clean." What followed was an impromptu confession that corroborated everything Marcus, Elizabeth, and Jack had presented. Detective Johnson detailed years of police complicity in the corruption, painting a damning picture of systemic abuse of power. As the detective spoke, Elizabeth caught Marcus's eye. They shared a look of disbelief and hope. This was more than they could have ever expected. When Detective Johnson finished, the room was silent for a beat, before erupting into a frenzy of questions and exclamations. Journalists were on their phones, calling in the breaking news. Cameras whirred as they captured every moment of the unfolding drama. Elizabeth stepped back to the microphone, her voice steady and clear. "What you've heard today is just the beginning. We call for a full, independent investigation into these allegations. The people of this city, of this state, deserve the truth, and we will not rest until they have it." As the press conference concluded, Marcus, Elizabeth, Jack, and Richard huddled together, overwhelmed by what had just transpired. They had thrown the first stone, and now an avalanche was beginning. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, they felt the tide turning in their favor. Outside, they could hear the growing crowd of supporters who had gathered, their chants for justice echoing through the streets. The city was waking up, and change was in the air. As they prepared to face the world outside, Marcus took a deep breath. "Whatever happens next," he said, looking at each of his allies in turn, "we face it together." Elizabeth nodded, a smile breaking through her tension. "Together," she agreed. And with that, they stepped out to meet their future, ready to continue their fight for justice, truth, and the soul of their community. As Marcus, Elizabeth, Jack, and Richard stepped out of the Hartley building, they were met with a sea of faces. The crowd that had gathered was a mix of community members, activists, and curious onlookers, all buzzing with the energy of what had just been revealed. Suddenly, a hush fell over the crowd as a familiar figure pushed through to the front. It was Michael Thompson, Marcus's childhood friend, who had risen through the ranks to become a high-level city official. His presence was unexpected, and tension rippled through the group. Michael's face was a mask of conflicting emotions as he approached Marcus. "I heard everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't be silent anymore." Marcus studied his old friend's face, seeing the weight of years of compromise and buried guilt. "What are you saying, Mike?" Michael took a deep breath, then turned to face the crowd and the gathered media. "My name is Michael Thompson," he announced, his voice growing stronger. "I'm the deputy mayor of this city, and I'm here to corroborate everything that's been said today." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Cameras flashed frantically as Michael began to speak, detailing his own role in the corruption and the pressure he'd faced to keep quiet. He named names, provided dates, and offered to turn over documents that would further prove the extent of the scandal. As Michael spoke, Marcus felt a mix of emotions: relief at this unexpected ally, sadness for the toll it had clearly taken on his friend, and hope for what this could mean for their cause. Elizabeth leaned in close to Marcus. "This changes everything," she whispered. With Michael's testimony, there's no way they can sweep this under the rug. Jack was already on his phone, calling his editor. We need to run a special edition, he was saying. This is bigger than we ever imagined. As the impromptu press conference continued, Richard Hartley stepped forward. In light of these revelations, he announced, I am pledging the full resources of Hartley Industries to aid in the investigation and to support the communities that have been affected by these corrupt practices. The crowd erupted in cheers. It was a stunning turnaround. One of the city's most powerful businessmen, now standing with the very communities his industry had once threatened. As the day wore on, the impact of their revelations began to ripple outward. Social media exploded with the news, hashtags trending as people shared clips from the press conference. Calls for resignations and investigations flooded the offices of state and federal authorities. By nightfall, the governor had announced the formation of a special task force to investigate the allegations. Several implicated officials had already resigned, and there were rumors of late-night meetings in the halls of power as the political establishment scrambled to respond. Marcus, Elizabeth, Jack, and Richard gathered in Richard's office, watching the news coverage and trying to process the whirlwind of events. We did it, Elizabeth said, a note of awe in her voice. We actually did it. Marcus nodded, but his expression was thoughtful. This is just the beginning, he said. We've exposed the truth, but now comes the hard part, actually changing the system. Jack agreed. We need to keep the pressure on. Make sure this investigation isn't just for show. And we need to start working on plans for real, community-led development. Richard, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. I have an idea, he said. What if we create a foundation? One that combines my business expertise with your grassroots knowledge. We could work to revitalize communities without displacing the people who live there. The idea took hold, and soon they were all contributing thoughts and plans. As the night wore on, their initial victory evolved into a vision for long-term change. As dawn broke, Marcus stood by the window, looking out over the city he'd fought so hard for. Elizabeth joined him, slipping her hand into his. What are you thinking? She asked softly. Marcus smiled, a mix of determination and hope in his eyes. I'm thinking about all the work we have ahead of us. But for the first time in a long time, I'm also thinking that real change is possible. Elizabeth squeezed his hand. Together? She asked. Marcus nodded, turning to include Jack and Richard in his gaze. Together, he affirmed. As the sun rose over the city, casting a warm glow over the streets they had fought to protect, the unlikely allies stood united. They had started this journey as strangers, a homeless man, a runaway heiress, an investigative journalist, and a powerful businessman. Now, they stood as friends, partners, and champions of a cause greater than themselves. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be setbacks, challenges, and fierce opposition, but they had ignited a spark of hope in their community, a belief that justice was possible and that ordinary people could stand up to corruption and win. As they looked out over the awakening city, they knew that this was not the end of their story, but a new beginning. The flames of freedom they had ignited would continue to burn, lighting the way towards a more just and equitable future for all.